guys, the Comics Kid 2099 here to talk to you about a book called, this is the Gormenghast trilogy, so it's 3 books here, but I have read the first one, which is called Titus Alone, which came out in 1946, I believe, written by Mervyn Peake, who was a painter and a poet, I think, and he wrote some novels. There were 3 books in the Gormenghast series, and there were plans for more, but Mervyn Peake died before any writing could be done on a 4th book. But I have heard a lot of people say that the Gormenghast books were very influential on the fantasy genre, and that at one time it was neck and neck with Tolkien's Lord of the Rings works. And I was very interested because before like a year ago, I had never even heard of these books. But now that I've read the first book, Titus Alone, I am not sure if I can say that these books are influential, as I heard some people say, and part of that is I am not as familiar with the modern fantasy genre as some people are, so others might be able to more easily point out where this book has influenced the genre, and I'm also not really confident in saying that this is as important in history as Tolkien's Lord of the Rings works. Even if we never got the Peter Jackson The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings movies, I feel like Tolkien's works are much more widely known by people, even if they haven't read the works. Now, maybe this is hard to say because, I mean, it's been 20 years since the first live-action Lord of the Rings movie, but even before that, we had a few animated movies. And so I feel like The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings were more well-known. I don't know, that maybe that's just me talking out of my butt, but this book, the first one, Titus Alone, I liked it. It's going to be very hard for me to talk about it. It's not really a fantasy story. It is set in this gigantic castle that's like built into a mountain called Gormenghast, and it's not a real place. We don't really know where this takes place or when it takes place. I've seen some people say that the characters kind of feel like they come out of a Charles Dickens novel, and I don't have my literary card to tear a corner off of, but I've never read any Charles Dickens, so I can't really speak to that. But I've heard some people say this isn't a fantasy book, but it is a fantasy of manners book. And maybe that's a good way to describe it because there are no wizards, there's no magical creatures in this book, but it's set in a time and place that does not really exist. There is no real-life Castle Gormenghast, and at times it feels like it's set in like the 1890s. It kind of had, like, mentally, I'm kind of getting this like Victorian era vibe from the story. Like whenever you hear about characters and how they're dressed, it kind of seems like 1880s, 1890s, something like that. But again, this castle and this world do not exist in the real world. And so in that regard, I guess I can see why people are calling it a fantasy story, sort of. But this is not your typical, or at least what I feel like your typical fantasy story is going to involve a character who lives in a place and then they go on a quest. The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, Star Wars, Aragon, even Game of Thrones. You have characters who kind of, they start in one place and then they go on an adventure somewhere else. Daenerys has a quest. Ned Stark reluctantly has a mission that he is trying to accomplish. So these characters, they are going on quests. The fantasy genre, I feel like, is built on characters going on an adventure somewhere else. And then there's a sense of discovery. This isn't like what it is back home. Remember Beggar's Canyon back home? Yeah, this is nothing like that. And so this book doesn't do that. This book is all set in this castle, and then you get some of it set like on the outskirts of the castle, because there are these people who live outside of the castle, and they are part of the society of the people who are in the castle, but they're also apart from them. And so most of it is set in or very near this gigantic castle called Gormenghast. And the Groan family, they are in charge of this castle. And we don't really have that many characters. We have Rockclawd, who is the curator. He appears in the first and last chapters. He's not really that important. Then we have Mr. Flay, who is the first servant to the Earl of Gormenghast, Sepulchrave. So we have Rockclawd, Flay, Sepulchrave, and then we have Swelter, who is the cook. Steerpike, who is one of the kitchen boys. Then we have Fuchsia, who is the Earl's daughter. Then we have Fuchsia's nurse, Mr. Slag. We have Dr. Prunesqualler and his sister. We have the Earl's two sisters, Cora and Clarice. Then we have the Earl's wife. I think that's... Oh, and then we have a wet nurse who lived outside of the castle. Her name is Kada. I said there's not that many characters, and here I'm listing like 13 of them. And then we have baby Titus, who's born at the very beginning of the book. And you're reading this book, and like 100 pages in, I'm thinking there's really not a whole lot of plot here. But I was still fascinated with the book. And incidentally, there was a TV miniseries that came out in the early 2000s, and that is what is being advertised here on the cover. It says, now a major TV series, the Millennium Drama. I wouldn't say that a miniseries is a major TV series, but this guy, he was in The Tudors. He played Henry VIII, and he was Dracula a few years ago. He plays Steerpike, the kitchen boy, in the miniseries. I know very little about the TV miniseries. I know very little about the books themselves. I've only read the first book, but anyway, so the first book is called Titus Groan, and little Titus, he is a baby. I think by the end of the book, he's just a little over 1 year old, and so I was expecting at some point, like, okay, he's born here, then we're going to have like a 12-year time jump, and then Titus is going to be our main character. No. By the end of the book, Titus really, he's not important, but he is, his birth kicks off the events that lead into what happens in this book. And so he is born, and then Mr. Flay, he somehow meets Steerpike, the kitchen boy, and then Steerpike and Mr. Flay, they are spying on Lord Sepulchrave and Dr. Prunesqualler, and Sepulchrave is saying, so the baby, he's really ugly, right? And Prunesqualler, he's trying to kind of avoid answering the question, and so then Steerpike, he has ambitions. He does not want to be a kitchen boy. He wants to have power and control over this society that lives in the castle. And so he tells Flay, okay, I'm going to go tell everybody that the Lord thinks that his son is ugly. And so Flay locks him in a closet. He manages to escape, and then he eventually ends up finding himself working for the doctor. And so throughout the book, while I would say this is an ensemble cast, the closest thing we have to a main character is Steerpike, who is also the villain of the story. It's interesting because, on the one hand, I can kind of respect the hustle, I guess, as the kids would say, in that we are seeing him trying to better himself and create a position for himself where he's not cleaning pots in a kitchen for the rest of his life. I kind of respect that, but on the other hand, the lengths that he is willing to go to secure power for himself makes him a very unlikable character, in my opinion. But also, one of the funniest scenes in the book comes from him, so I'm torn. Anyway, so then we get to see Steerpike interacting with Fuchsia, who feels very real. Like, out of all the characters, I don't know, Fuchsia kind of feels the most authentic to me, and I really liked her. At the beginning, I wasn't sure I was going to like her, and by the end, I really kind of liked her. But anyway, we get to see a whole lot of character interactions in the story. And like I said, about the first 100 pages or so, you might be thinking nothing has happened. Like, that's right around the point when Fuchsia first meets Steerpike. But you're getting introduced to all these characters. Like I said, there's about 13 of them or so. And there are some plots that don't really intersect with each other. Kada, she is the wet nurse for Titus, and then after a little while she says, I need to leave, I need to go back to where I live. And then she has these two guys who both want to be her lover, and then some stuff happens there, and she eventually comes back, and then that just kind of stops, and I am assuming that that will get picked up in the next book, which is called Gormenghast. And I'm assuming that some of the subplots that are kind of left lingering at the end of this book will continue and grow and be concluded in the next two books, hopefully. But anyway, most of of what we see in this book, it comes from Steerpike. After Titus is born, Steerpike says, okay, well, his dad thinks that he's ugly, so I'm going to go tell everyone. And then that kind of leads to him meeting Fuchsia, and then from there meeting Dr. Prunesqualler and getting his job there. And then some minor spoilers, but he meets Fuchsia's aunts, who they believe that they have been slighted. They believe that their brother has taken all of their prestige from them. They used to have hundreds of servants around here. Now they don't have any who are tending to their needs. And so Steerpike is telling them, I can help you, so you guys need to set the Lord's library on fire. And he thinks, like, if that happens, then Sepulchre, he's basically just going to be an empty shell of himself, because he lives for his books. He loves his books. And then somehow also Steerpike wanted one of the main servants, Sourdough. So there's another character I forgot to mention. He wants Sourdough to somehow die in his fire, and then he can somehow take Sourdough's place. Now, there's a whole lot of how do you know that Sourdough is going to die in the fire? He does, but then it turns out Sourdough had a son, Barkentine, and Barkentine takes Sourdough's place. So I'm thinking, Steerpike, how did you know that Sourdough would die, of all people? How did you know that a whole bunch of other people wouldn't die? And maybe he just doesn't care if a whole bunch of people die. He does seem to not care that Sourdough died. And then how do you know, if Sourdough dies, and if he didn't have a son, how do you know that you would be able to take his place? Because a whole lot of what works for him basically just comes down to luck, really. But anyway, a lot of what happens here, it comes from the fact that Titus was born. His birth is the inciting incident for this story. It just takes about a third of the book for the plot to start rolling. But like I said, this is not a quest story. This is all centered around this one location. And so in that way, it is very different than a lot of the fantasy stories I'm familiar with. And I guess I should say I first heard about these books because of George R.R. Martin, who writes the A Song of Ice and Fire books. He had mentioned that he was a really big fan of them, and in fact, in some of his books, there are some not so subtle references to these books. In one of the Duncan Egg stories, Gorman Peak is a character. Gormenghast, Mervyn Peake wrote the Gormenghast books, so that's a reference. And then in, I believe, Fire and Blood, it mentions some of the other characters from that house. There's Mervyn Flowers, I believe, is one, and then there's someone else who's also from House Peak. There's maybe a couple characters from House Peak, but and I think their house seat is Starpike, Steerpike. So there are some references in the Song of Ice and Fire books to these books. At one point, I think in Gormenghast they mention like just this, how many rooms there are, and like you would never be able to find all the rooms. There's secret rooms, and there's, you know, if you're in one part of the castle, you would be lost, and you might never be able to find your way to another part of the castle. To me, that kind of reminded me of Winterfell, and how they mentioned in the books that they kept building on to Winterfell, and it wasn't all built at one time, and if you're in one part of Winterfell, good luck finding another part, and it kind of sort of reminded me of that. But yeah, despite myself, I'm really surprised that I actually really like this book. I wasn't sure what I was going to think of it, because I saw a lot of people, even before I read it, saying it's a fantasy story, but it's kind of not, and I really didn't know what they meant by that, and now that I've read the first book, okay, yeah, I get it now. But I kind of liked it, and I'm really excited to read the next two books, and I'm very curious. I'd love to find other books that were influenced by this. That's something that I'd love to find a website out there where you could just type in, I really loved Titus Groan, and then it could say, if you like this, you will like these other books. I've looked for that, and I haven't really found something that actually works like that. A lot of times it will say, you know, oh, you like Frankenstein? You might really enjoy, I don't know, Animal Man by Grant Morrison, something that doesn't have anything to do with Frankenstein. So I really like this book, and I'm really interested in diving into the next two. That is my attempt at kind of, sort of not doing a spoilery video, although I did spoil some stuff. But anyway, I hope that you guys like this video. Hopefully, I was able to convince at least one of you to go out and check this out and see if you like it, because I don't see enough people talking about this series. I just accidentally stumbled upon it about a year ago. But those are my thoughts on Titus Groan. I hope you guys liked this video, and I will see you guys in the future with something else. In the meantime, have a great rest of your day. Catch you later.